Good morning and welcome to today's seminar. We have a forum today on a very important Supreme Court decision, the Mahmoud decision. This forum is being brought to you by the Public School Defenders Hub and PEN America. And we're very fortunate to have with us for this discussion two people who are very involved and knowledgeable about this issue. I'll introduce Jenny Samuels and Taston Magnuson. Thank you both for joining us. In a few minutes, they'll have an opportunity to give you a little bit about their background and what their involvement is. But just to set a little bit of a background before we start the discussion, remember that public schools in the recent decades, and particularly the last 10 years, have come under much stronger attack than in the past. There's always been controversies in public education about curriculum, about teaching. How do we teach the new math? How do we teach reading? And sometimes those battles have been quite severe, particularly about evolution a couple of decades ago, a prayer in the public schools when I went to grammar school. But in the last few years, that's intensified. There are now movements, as I'm sure most of you on this call know, to really change public education, as we've noted in the past, to something completely different, to sort of privatize it. Some people may talk about vouchers, some may talk about school choice. There's many ways in which this discussion takes place, but there are movements and people in this country and organizations whose real goal is to replace the public school system as we've developed it in the United States, which has been a foundational feature of our success, both economically and politically. And that's taken new turns in the last few years. And the reason I mention all of this is the Mahmoud decision, which deals with the right of parents to opt out of portions of the curriculum that they don't want their children exposed to, opens up a new and potentially very dangerous front in this attack on public education. So our goal this morning is to, first of all, understand the decision itself, the legal aspect of it, which Jenny will take us through. And then Taston will begin a discussion about how that decision can be used by the enemies of public education, as we understand it, to slowly weaken and potentially destroy public education. So that's the background. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to tell you her role in the case and give you an idea of what the legal issue is all about. Take it away, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thanks so much to everyone who's joining us. I know some people are joining from the West Coast where it's early in the morning, so I appreciate you taking time on a Saturday morning to join us for this really important discussion. So as Andy mentioned, my name is Jenny Samuels. I'm an attorney with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And in my role, I litigate on First Amendment issues related to public education and other instances of people using religious freedom as a tool to harm others and to undermine our, institutions. And so a lot of my work focuses on those issues. And I authored Americans United's amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the case we're talking about today, Mahmoud v. Taylor. So I will jump right into talking about the decision. So this case started when a school district in Maryland approved books with LGBT characters and themes for inclusion in its language arts curriculum. And the school district's goal was very noble, right? It was to make the curriculum more inclusive and to ensure that the curriculum materials represented the communities that were in the schools and represented the students' lived experiences. And at first, the school district allowed parents who objected to these books to opt their children out of lessons that featured the new books. But the school district eventually did away with this opt-out option because it found that allowing parents to pull their kids out of the classroom whenever these materials came up was, one, really, really disruptive. And two, it served to undermine the whole purpose of including these books. And it stigmatized LGBT people, it stigmatized students with LGBT family members, and it stigmatized the themes of these books. And so the school district said, we're not going to allow parents to pull their kids out of these lessons any longer. We just can't manage it, and it is harmful to our students. So a group of religious parents sued the school district. And they argued that they had a right under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment to shield their children from these materials which they religiously objected to. So just to go back in time a little bit, before this case, parents did not have a broad right to opt their kids out of public school curriculum materials or lessons that they religiously objected to. The Supreme Court had ruled in a series of cases that public schools couldn't force students to actively affirm ideas or perform certain actions that they had religious objections to. So students couldn't be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance or stand up and salute the flag if they had a religious objection to doing so. But before Mahmoud, parents had no constitutional right to shield their kids from exposure to ideas that they disagreed with. So while kids in public schools couldn't be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, schools could expose children in a classroom to the Pledge of Allegiance without violating those kids' First Amendment rights. So there was this distinction between mere exposure to ideas one might disagree with and actively requiring affirmation of those ideas or compelling actions that suggest that you support the ideas. In Mahmoud, the Supreme Court jettisoned this distinction between exposure and action, and it dramatically expanded the scope of religious exemptions in the public school context. So the Supreme Court in Mahmoud ruled in favor of the parents who had sued the school district. Justice Alito wrote for the majority of the court, and he announced a new test for free exercise clause violations in the public school context. And he said a free exercise clause violation occurs whenever curriculum materials threaten to undermine the religious beliefs that parents wish to instill in their children. And he said that the books that were introduced by this Maryland school district failed that test because he said they were designed to present a specific viewpoint to impressionable young children. And he said they presented a message that runs counter to the religious values that parents are trying to instill in their children. So the result of the majority decision in this case is that parents have a much broader right in some cases to opt their kids out of curriculum materials that they religiously object to, if they can show that the materials undermine the religious worldview that they're trying to teach their children. Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, authored dissenting opinion, just excoriating the majority. She said, Justice Sotomayor, in writing her dissent, she said, this decision is horrible for democracy. Public schools are where kids learn to coexist peacefully, right? And to practice living in a multicultural society. But if kids are insulated from any ideas that they disagree with, they'll never learn tolerance or how to peacefully coexist with ideas they oppose. And these are really core skills that you need to learn to exist in a pluralistic society like ours. She also said that this decision will cause chaos in public schools. She said that notifying parents, offering the chance to opt out for every lesson or book that might offend a parent's religious beliefs will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for schools to manage. And she said that schools will have to divert resources to come up with individual lesson plans for those students who are opted out. And they'll have to come up with staff to supervise the students who are opted out. And all of this will present a really heavy administrative burden on public schools. And Justice Sotomayor continued, she said, a lot of schools will just say it's too hard to manage these individual religious opt-outs. So we're just going to cut the materials from our curriculums that might raise religious objections. So a lot of schools will say we're too nervous about dealing with the administrative headache of all of these individual opt-outs to various parts of our curriculum. So we're just going to cut any materials that might offend someone's religious beliefs from the curriculum altogether. And so Justice Sotomayor referred to this as the chilling effect of the decision. And the chilling effect goes beyond LGBT inclusive materials. It could cause schools to cut lessons on evolution, or to pull books that express support for women's rights, or that show people in a modest dress, or that depict interfaith marriages. There's any number of subjects, and these are real examples of things that parents have objected to for religious reasons in the public school context. So there's any number of subjects that you could imagine that someone somewhere might raise religious objections to. Overall, we know that this case will make it easier for parents to opt their children out of public school curriculum materials that they religiously object to. But it's still not clear exactly how broad the ruling is. So to narrow Mahmoud's impact, for example, there are ways that courts evaluating religious objections could distinguish from the objections at issue in Mahmoud. So Justice Alito, in his majority decision, he focused on specific facts in finding that the curriculum violated the parents' free exercise rights. The books were being presented to younger children who were between 5 and 11 years old. And he said that those young children are particularly impressionable and, to the being swayed by teachers and, being swayed in school. And so if curriculum materials are being presented to older kids or teenagers, that might not present the same issues. Also, according to Justice Alito, and if you actually read these books, I think you would probably disagree with Justice Alito on this, but he said that the books didn't just objectively present information, but were trying to strongly send a message that LGBT identity should be celebrated and normalized, which of course is something that I and many others on this call probably think is a good thing. However, that's what Justice Alito said was an issue in Mahmoud. So if there were curriculum materials that could be shown to be, just objectively presenting information and not celebrating any particular point of view, that might also be a way that courts could distinguish those materials from the materials that were found unconstitutional in Mahmoud.
Okay.
In Mahmoud,
Go ahead. Sorry, I thought you might be finished there, but go ahead, continue.
Oh, I just have one more point that also
please.
in Mahmoud, the teachers had been given instructions on how to talk about the books. Which, and again, if you actually look at what those instructions were, they were pretty straightforward and actually told the teachers to be very considerate and respectful of students' differing perspectives. However, Justice Alito kind of twisted those facts, and he said that, those instructions were coercive to children and hostile to religious beliefs. And so if their curriculum materials were not presented alongside instructions to teachers, or if the instructions to teachers were, not coercive or not hostile to religious belief, that might be another way that courts could distinguish religious objections in the future. So overall, evaluation of whether parents have the right to opt their kid out of any given book or curriculum material would need to be really fact intensive and would happen on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Well, that's very clear and very detailed explanation. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for it. And I wanted to, from a layman's point of view, of course, you're speaking as an attorney. This is one of a series of decisions that's come around the last few years. We had the decision about the coach praying in a football game before. And so what's at stake from the point of view of a layman is this constant battle between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And for a lot of our history, particularly since the 50s, for about 70 years, courts have tended more towards worry about the Establishment Clause. They've been more worried about coercive actions by the state to enforce religion. But now I think what we see with this Alito decision and the Ten Commandments and the Bible being introduced in various southern states, we see the shift now, as you mentioned in your presentation, that now they're focused on the Free Exercise Clause. And anything that they think undermines, even in a public environment, that undermines what they consider free exercise, is what they're going to rule that way rather than looking at the Establishment Clause. And so that's the battle that we're in, is the battle between these two ideas of what the First Amendment really stands for and how you interpret the First Amendment. And that was a tremendous explanation of the legal issues. And you also opened the door in your explanation to explain how it could be weaponized. So I'm going to turn it over to Taslin, who has a lot of experience in understanding how these extremists and very orthodox religious people will look for the opening to sometimes take advantage of these openings. So Taslin, take it away and give us a discussion of what we might be facing as a result of this decision.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here and to talk about this really important case. And Jenny, thanks so much for all of the very detailed, clear um, reading of the case, because I am definitely not a lawyer. And I am not, it's important for me to set the table of kind of where I come from. I work with Penn America. I'm the senior advisor to the Freedom to Read team. And so, as part of that work, I am both an author and an advocate. And I have spent since probably actually for over a year working with the authors whose books were part of Mahmoud v. Taylor. And so they began to contact Penn America as the case gained steam because groups, including the law firms that were representing the parents, put out a lot of disinformation and sort of very pernicious, hostile interpretations of their picture books, which I have, it's probably very blurry, but I definitely always display them because they're gorgeous and lovely stories about kids and families. So I've worked with these authors all the way through the decision. And it's so important to understand a little bit about Kidlit, a little bit about authors of Kidlit and what they're trying to do. And they really think a lot about their audience. And they think about what it means for young people to find themselves in the pages of a book. And I think that that can get lost in all of the legal conversations and lost in the fight to protect these books. But these are people who have spent the last year enduring a lot of threatening misinformation about their books and why they wrote them. That is pretty extraordinary. And it represents what's happening across the country to authors and books everywhere. And so one of the things to think about is like this has been labeled as a book banning case, but it's not a book banning case, right? As Jenny really laid out, it's about what schools have to do, and that's what makes it kind of like the perfect storm for these groups that really want to dismantle public education, move it to voucher systems, privatize it, make it evangelical. So there's a whole groups of people who have been behind a lot of book bans. And one of the things that they are looking for is the ways in which to weaponize the systems that already exist. So opt-outs as a term have existed in public education for a long time, but have been very narrow. And they're sort of like the last resort for you and your child in a particular case, in a particular moment in your educational experience with your family. They aren't meant for wide scale movements. And what they are doing, these groups, is they are training folks to now use Mahmoud as the excuse to do vast amounts of opting out. And what that does is it comes at a time where we've had 4 years and more of vague legislation, um, immense amounts of federal and state pushback against civil rights, anti-library, anti-school movements, all gaining traction. So we have a perfect storm. We have groups that have been pushing for the destruction of public education for a long time. We have an anti-book banning movement that has been gaining traction. And together they're meeting after Mahmoud. And this equals fear. And fear provides opportunities for groups whose whole purpose has been to disable public education. And it's a perfect storm now also for both external censorship and self-censorship within schools. So I feel like I'm telling a story that could take me hours in just moments. But what is going to happen next? There are a lot of groups who are prepared to push to get their kids opted out, and this will require additional lessons, additional plans, additional opportunities. And I think it's really important also to remember that this case is about elementary school. So if we narrow our conversation for a minute to what it's like in elementary school and English language curriculum in elementary school, it's not like what you might think about ninth grade English. ELA curriculum is part of the experience of being in those grades. And so to ask for an opt-out from a lesson around that is asking a teacher to begin to pull apart their curriculum and destabilize their curriculum and provide alternatives and places for kids to be supervised. So it's pretty significant. So then on top of that, these books, so Heather Has Two Mommies is the first really widely known LGBTQ piece, a picture book that's affirming of LGBTQ families. That came out in 1989. So these books are relatively new in the scheme of things as making their way into curriculum, into libraries. And so they're relatively new. And then, sorry, there's a lot to cover. So they have to provide it provides an immense burden on teachers. And then secondarily, teachers are already burdened incredibly in classrooms. So what we're looking at is a teacher having to choose under extreme pressure to provide an opt-out lesson, provide an opt-out opportunity, create the system by which families can exercise their religious rights and still use these books that are relatively new in the curriculum. And so what we're going to end up with is people will not have the time, energy, space, or ability to continue to provide LGBTQ affirming literature in classrooms. And who's going to be hurt by that? Every kid. Every kid. Every kid deserves not only to see themselves represented in the books in their classroom, but they deserve to learn about their friends, learn about the people that are in their community, because in every classroom, I promise you, this is an issue. This is who kids' friends are. This is who they're playing with on the playground. And books create the space for us to learn about each other. And that is the purpose and the goal and the benefit of a public education together. And what we're asking for is for that opportunity for our young kids to be removed. And that's wrong. I could keep going. Sometimes it's easier to ask more specific questions about it. But I mean, basically, these groups are active. They've been planning for a long time. We saw the opt-out trainings roll out, and we need to be ready to stand up for these books and stand up for the kids and the readers that absolutely deserve these books. Should I keep going or should we start talking?
We'll go back to, we'll come back to you in a second. I appreciate the detail and the warning is the most important point here, because as Jenny explained, this decision as it stands now is somewhat general. It's vague. There's some areas that aren't really well defined. And it's our job to try to defend those, make that vagueness more concrete. But on the other hand, there's going to be people that use that vagueness as a weapon. And that's really where we find ourselves in this battle. So, but I do want to emphasize a point, Taslin, that you made over and over again, but I want to just put a different spin on it. The battle that we're in is the battle over the way public education evolved in this country and what we mean by public education. It's important to remember that the other side calls what they're doing public education also. So we have to be really careful about that, because they will say, if I pay taxes for schools and you give me a voucher that I can use that money to the school of my choice, that's public education, because you gave me the taxpayer money to do it. And I've had this discussion a couple of times with people, and that's what they say. Well, this is public education. I'm sending my child to a charter school using a voucher or taking money from the normal public schools, the traditional public schools, putting it into a charter school. So what we're trying to preserve is the type of public education as we know it, which had a very narrow definition of when people could opt out. So I'd like to move to just a different phase where maybe each of you, Jenny first and then Taslin, if you could just summarize in maybe 2 or 3 minutes what you think is the absolute key takeaway you'd like people to remember about the legal side, and Taslin, what you think they should take away from the danger side. If you could just summarize that in maybe 2 minutes, and then we can maybe finish up with that. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Taslin, for I think the way that this case is talked about, sometimes for example, Justice Alito, I think in his majority opinion, kind of treated opt-outs as like a victimless occurrence. But there are victims to that, and children suffer, their education suffers, their ability to see themselves in the curriculum suffers, and their whole education experience suffers. So I really appreciate you kind of like highlighting that, because I think that really does get lost in the conversation, where people only see the harms on one side, but not the harms to the kids who are left in the classroom once the kids who are opted out leave. So that's really, really important. Yeah, but I think one thing I hope that people come away with is just that we should push back on the idea that public school administrators need to obey in advance or pull materials off the shelves because they think someone somewhere might be offended by it. While Mahmoud does allow for broader individual religious opt-outs, it does not require schools to alter the curriculums as a whole or censor themselves to conform with certain views. And it would be a really horrible thing if schools saw Mahmoud as a green light to just pull these books off the shelves entirely, because that's not what Mahmoud says. And so we need to support school districts in keeping these books on the shelves, even if they have to contend with these like really onerous opt-outs. We need to support them and push them to keep the books on the shelves, or else, the people who are in favor of censorship win. And so we really want to prevent that from happening, because Mahmoud does not say that schools need to pull these books from the shelves altogether.
Go ahead, Taslin.
Sure. That's probably the essence of my message as well. Mahmoud is a very narrow decision, and already I'm seeing not only vast amounts of groups training their constituents to push for opt-outs, but I'm seeing people being scared. And what I need for you to do is I need you to stand up for these books. I need you to stand up for these students affirmatively and positively now in your districts, with your teachers. Thank these librarians for having these books, for showing children representation of all families, because what that does, and we know this from our work at Pet America, is it provides an inoculation for when these pressures come to your district. Because not only do we need to fight the moment when people are training parents on how to use opt-out to be disruptive, but we need to be prepared and to be speaking for these books today. And right now in your room, because we know that reading about others and reading about themselves makes a difference in the lives of young people. And that is what is at threat here. There's a lot of public education at threat, yes, but what it means to grow up and have these books makes a difference. If I've heard from so many students and so many teachers, if they had just had Love Violet and learned it was okay to have a crush on another little girl, what that would have done to make them feel okay about themselves. And okay about their experiences in their life. And so that's what we need to keep focused on in the midst of all the other things we need to be fighting right now and working on, is that young people need these books and have a right to these books, and you don't have to let them go because you're scared. I need you to be brave, and I need you to say yes to these books and yes to these books as a parent, and go into your school and support those teachers, because they also need to know that you have their back. That's my message.
No, I agree. That's a great message. And I tell you, we would all benefit greatly if we could summon up the passion that you have. We could all summon up that passion in our local battles. I think we'd be in much better shape. Yeah, we do have a lot of questions in the chat. We don't have time for all of them, but I think one, Jenny, is particularly important. People have asked in the chat, just give us an idea of the scope of the decision. Does it go beyond materials like books? How does it deal with other peripheral material other than books? If you could just address that, I think that would be an important point for the audience to understand.
I think that is the million-dollar question right now. And I don't think anyone has a firm answer to that question. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, predicted that these arguments could be used to go way beyond just challenging books. So she said, what about when someone in a classroom, a student in a classroom has a teacher who is in a same-sex marriage? can their parent then pull their kid from that classroom and demand them to be put in another class because they religiously object to same-sex marriage? That seems to be something that this decision opens up, but it's a real question of whether those types of things would fall under the same analysis of Mahmoud. There was a recent case where parents tried to challenge a school district that permits students to use whatever bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. These parents tried to use Mahmoud to argue that somehow that bathroom policy violated their rights under Mahmoud, and the court said absolutely not. This has nothing to do with that. So that was a good sign that courts are thinking very cautiously about the decision and its scope and not letting it be abused in such a dramatic way. But there are a lot of different judges in this country with a lot of different perspectives, and there are judges that want to expand Mahmoud as far as possible. And I think right now we have a Supreme Court with a conservative majority that is eager to stretch religious exemptions as far as possible, and who are not thoughtful about protecting our public schools or protecting our children from censorship and the harms of censorship. They're just not concerned about that. And so I think that's the danger that we're faced with. So short answer is that we just don't know how far this decision will go, but there are some decisions that are good thus far on kind of limiting its scope.
And right now, as I understand, this decision dealt specifically with primary education. It didn't specifically extend to secondary education. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Justice Alito emphasized that the books were being offered to younger kids who were between 5 and 11. So that's one other way that courts evaluating religious exemptions or schools dealing with religious exemption requests could kind of distinguish. They could say these books are being offered for older kids who are less, persuadable. And so that's another way to distinguish along those lines. Yeah.
Before we wrap it up, Taslin, do you want to add anything to that when we talk about the possible expansion of these problems?
Absolutely. I think yes, the ruling is narrow, but the culture and the climate has been prepped for it to be as broad as possible. And so that's why I keep coming back to the inoculation idea, that you need to be speaking and acting positively, proactively, and publicly for these books in your district right now. And for the ability of kids at every level to see themselves on the pages of the books, because when that pressure comes to remove the middle school LGBTQ literature, when that provides too much of an impressionable take, and when it comes even further to the high school, your district and your teachers will be prepared and ready to speak up for this and speak up for the benefit of this literature and the professionalization of the educators that are in that district. I think it's so important to remember that Mahmoud comes at the end of 4 years of massive school book censorship that we've tracked at Pan America. And so we're while it is narrow and it is important to keep track of that part of it, everybody is prepared to be scared. And when we're scared, we make bad decisions, not only for ourselves, but for the young people in public education. And so we want to keep our eyes focused forward on what kids need. And I know all these educators who are on here and elsewhere are doing that. And I just want to bring as many parents and authors and community members in behind you to support you. And to help you have the resources you need to succeed and to take care of the kids that are in your charge. I did see one question about why kids don't get homeschooled. And I think, again, that's a whole nother debate. But part of that is you need to see this as a long movement where parents' individual fears about their kids and what their kids are experiencing are being weaponized by some political movements that we've written about them at Penn. Other people have written great materials about them, but people are being swept into a movement, and the movement is designed to hurt public education. And so keep coming back around to that. There's more here and speak up for these books.
It's one battle in this major fight. I want to thank, though, both Jenny and Taslin for all of their information, and particularly thank the people who are listening in. And I think both of you laid the groundwork for, I think, a very good kind of summary here, a little closing comments. And the closing comments are kind of simple. I mean, it's a battle that we have been overwhelmed. We're not as well organized. We're not ready. And I think both Taslin and Jenny laid the groundwork for the fact that we should be ready. And what does that mean? We hope that everybody on this call and all the friends and colleagues that you have on this call can be activated by this. There's many ways to be activated. School boards are going to be fighting this battle. How do we comply? You can play a role in making sure that they comply in the narrowest possible way. So they're in compliance with the law, but they don't give in to the pressures that Taslin's identified to widen this and expand it and attack more and more. So we want everyone to be activated. Go to school board meetings. The three organizations represented here, the Public School Defenders Hub, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and PEN America, and other organizations are in the front lines of this fight. So you can join them. You can go to their websites, get more information, join in some way, and participate in this battle. We will actually do a follow-up ourselves. We'll follow up with everyone who tuned in this morning to hear this discussion, and we'll give you some additional resources. We'll try to give you some resources that might respond to some of the questions in the chat room that we didn't get to, and we'll also give you some contact information for these organizations. But the bottom line is, thank you everybody for participating, and let's hope that this lets us understand the nature of this fight and how Mahmoud decision fits into a broader battle, and hopefully we'll all come out of this with the knowledge from Jenny and the passion from Taslin, and all of a sudden we'll regain the momentum and protect and defend public education. Thank you, everyone.